Well, welcome back. Our second panel today is titled Polarization and the Administrative State. This panel features two of the authors of the book we've been discussing today, Parchment Barriers, Political Polarization, and the Limits of Constitutional Order. So we'll begin with the authors and then have commentary from two further panelists. Let me introduce them all now. Our first speaker today is Kenneth Miller. Kenneth Miller is the Associate Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College, where he also serves as co-director of the Dreyer Roundtable and Associate Director of the Rose Institute of State and Local Government. He's co-editor with Zach Kurser and Eric Helland of the book we've been discussing today, Parchment Barriers. His contribution to the book is titled Polarization and the Administrative State. So who better to have on a panel on Polarization and the Administrative State? So thank you for joining us. Our second panelist and our second contributor to the book is Michael Grieva. Michael is Professor of Law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he teaches constitutional law, administrative law, federal courts, legislation, and conflict of laws. He's written a great number of scholarly articles and books, including The Upside Down Constitution. His contribution to this book is titled Federalism in a Polarized Age. Our third speaker will be Sally Katzen. Sally is Professor of Practice and Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the New York University Law School. She's the Professor of Practice because she has a lot of practice in governance. She served almost 8 years in the Clinton administration, first as Administrator in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at the Office of Management and Budget, and then as Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, and then finally as Deputy Director for Management at OMB. Her full profile is in the program, but I do want to add she recently agreed to join the Gray Center as one of our distinguished senior fellows, along with Ron Cass, Boyden Gray, Krista Muth, and Paul Verkyle, and we're so glad that she could join us institutionally and today. And then finally, our fourth speaker will be William Galston. Bill is the Ezra K. Zilka Chair and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies Program. Prior to January 2006, he was the Saul Stern Professor and Acting Dean at University of Maryland's School of Public Policy. He previously served as Deputy Assistant to President Clinton for Domestic Policy. He's now the co-chair of the New Center with Bill Kristol, and his most recent book is Anti-Pluralism, The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy. In addition to all of his other writings, in case you don't already know, Bill writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal on politics and ideas. It's a must-read column every week, and we're so glad that he can join us today. Now, I just want to say at the outset of the discussion, the question of polarization and the administrative state, you'll find that Ken's chapter and Mike's chapter in the book really do explore all the variations on this theme. First of all, how polarization affects the demands that all Americans place on government and our expectations for government. And second, how polarization affects the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, in overseeing the federal agencies that carry out the laws. And then finally, we see how polarization affects what happens inside of the agencies themselves. And as Michael Grieva further observes, polarization has also shaped federalism as we know it today, especially in its relationship to the presidency and administration. And so with that, let me turn it over to Ken Miller.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Adam and also Zach Kurser for their instrumental work in bringing this conference together. And I'd like to say just a word about the book. It's been a great project. Mike Grieva has been a tremendous contributor, and George Thomas as well. And it's been a great project. Among other things we've done as part of this project is because it had a Madisonian theme, we did an authors conference at Montpelier, James Madison's home. It's now been 3 years ago, as we were still sort of designing the chapters. This was in 2016, before the election, and we had sort of an understanding of what polarization looked like before the election of Donald Trump. And the book was about ready to go before the election, and the election hit, and we realized that we needed to adjust and recalibrate and add some new material. And one of the questions we had going in was whether Donald Trump would fundamentally change the nature of polarization in the United States, because he wasn't really a conventional conservative Republican. certainly not a limited government Republican in the same way that others who preceded him were. And so we had a little bit of trepidation, at least I did, not knowing whether this book would still sort of work after the election of Trump. But one of the things that we quickly found is that our president quickly fell into the same paradigm that we had been working with prior to the election, which is to say he has governed, at least with respect to many things, as a ideological conservative, and especially with respect to this topic here, the administrative state. He came into office, and one of his primary goals was what he called the deconstruction of the administrative state. Right? That was one of the three primary objectives of his administration in 2017, according to Steve Bannon, his then primary advisor, now departed from the White House. But Steve Bannon said this is one of the three verticals or key principles of our administration is to deconstruct the administrative state. And so it fit nicely into the chapter I was working on, again, reinforcing the partisan nature of our politics, even under a disruptive president like Donald Trump. So I'll say one other thing about the book is we have a collection of authors, many of whom are from Claremont McKenna College, the Claremont colleges, Mike here from Mason, but we had, I think, an unusually high number of people who are able to and interested in looking at this problem of polarization from a broader perspective of political philosophy and history and the deep roots of the institutions of American government. There's been a lot written about polarization in American politics today over the last decade or more. And I think this is one of the few books that really looks at it from a broader, more institutional perspective, looking at each of the institutions of American government and seeing how our contemporary polarization is affecting them. So this chapter that Eric Helen, my co-author, and I worked on was looking at the federal bureaucracy or the administrative state to see how it interacts with polarization. And we looked at a couple of things. First of all, to what extent does the growth or nature of the administrative state contribute to our polarization? And then secondly, in what ways does our contemporary polarization affect the operation of the administrative state? So we're sort of looking at both dimensions of it. And then sort of situating the administrative state historically within its institutional context. And because this is a book about the Constitution in Madison, the starting point for our analysis was that there is really no clear description of the administrative state or federal administration in the Constitution. And it's been sometimes called a hole in the Constitution in terms of how public administration would work in our system of federal government. And people had some intuitions about that, but one of the features of the American national government, for at least through much of the 19th century, was it had a much less developed system or apparatus of administration than many European democracies, for example. And it was only toward the end of the 19th century when what we would now consider the administrative state began to take root. Woodrow Wilson was a key proponent of shifting administration into agencies where there would be professional, nonpartisan, detached experts who would implement public policy to the extent possible insulated from normal politics and political institutions. And so that was the vision that we called the progressive vision, or the turn of the 20th century progressive vision of the bureaucracy or the administrative state. And so you begin to see it taking hold beginning in the 1880s or so, accelerating during the Progressive era and certainly during the New Deal, and amplified even more during the Great Society and forward. And so I think one of the questions we were looking at is what was the partisan or was there a partisan division over the growth of the administrative state? And there was certainly controversy at each stage of the expansion or development of the administrative state, but it didn't necessarily fall neatly along party lines. If you look at, just to take an example, sort of the expansion of the federal role in healthcare during the 1960s, Medicare and Medicaid, there was bipartisan support for that in Congress at that time. There was nothing close to what we saw with the ACA, where there was strict partisan division over whether to adopt Obamacare or not. And so, also if you look at the presidents of the mid-20th century, Eisenhower didn't really make any significant effort to repeal or roll back the New Deal. Nixon, coming in 1969, didn't make a significant effort to repeal or deconstruct the Great Society. They basically consolidated those expansions of the administrative state and had some different takes on how they should be administered, but it was not anything like the partisan division that we now see over the administrative state. We trace a change and an increasing partisan division over the administrative state to the Reagan era, where Reagan had a philosophical concern or opposition to the growing federal bureaucracy, and Democrats during that period were increasingly ideologically more consistent in their support for a growing federal government. You see the diminution of the role of Southern conservatives in the Democratic Party during this era, and so the Democratic Party is becoming more consistently liberal or progressive, the Republican Party more consistently conservative. And so attitudes about the size, scope, and role of the administrative state over the last generation or two has become a key division between the two parties. The competing visions of what the federal government should be doing and how it should be doing it is now central to our partisan debates. Okay, so that's one theme. The second theme we look at in this chapter is, in what ways has our contemporary polarization affected the operation of the administrative state? So, as I said, the original conception of the federal bureaucracy was that it would be insulated from politics to the extent possible. And it would be sort of set aside for neutral, nonpartisan, professional administration of policy. But it couldn't ever really be purely that, because we have a constitutional system of the three branches of government, and this system of agencies and bureaucracies had to be grafted into an existing constitutional design, which allowed for checks and balances and separation of powers. And so the parties, because they control these branches, did have some control over the administrative state from the earliest time, right? What we find, though, is that there is increasing desire by the parties to exercise greater control over agency decision-making and behavior as two things happen. As the administrative state grows in its power and scope, the stakes become higher. And as polarization increases and there's this increasing partisan division over what the administrative state should be and how it should act and how powerful it should be, then it becomes a partisan fight over the size and scope of the administrative state. And so what we point to is, first of all, in what ways do the three branches of government have the ability to exercise control over the administrative state? Initially, if you look at political science from a generation ago, the general belief was that Congress had the greatest power over the bureaucracy, that there was sort of a principal-agent model, with Congress being the principal, the agencies being the agents, and Congress, which creates the agencies and funds them and can defund them and can pass new legislation to control their behavior, had the largest degree of control over the bureaucracy. And that conception has changed over time for a number of different reasons. And now we understand the president to have at least as much control or more control over the agencies than Congress does. And I would submit that one of the reasons for that is our growing polarization, that it becomes harder and harder for Congress to exercise meaningful control over agencies if Congress is polarized and experiences gridlock internally, right? Especially the kind of polarization where there is even division between the two parties, because if you had polarization and a large majority by one party, then they could exercise, and especially if there was unified government with the president and basically a one-party dominant Congress, then Congress could exercise more control over the agencies. But in a system of polarization and equal division between the two parties, Congress has a very difficult time exercising meaningful control over agencies. So if an agency, so Health and Human Services, passes a regulation based on some statute that was enacted in the past, and the present Congress, a big block of the present Congress doesn't like that regulation, Congress has a difficult time overturning it because of the even division and the polarization of the Congress. Also, meaningfully, Congress doesn't have the same, I think George spoke to this, the same institutional, I guess, jealousy of its powers as Madison suggested it would in Federalist 51, right? That ambition would check ambition. Instead, individual members of Congress are tightly aligned with their partisan orientation, and they're going to either support the president and the administration of their own party and support the policy objectives of the agencies, or they're going to oppose them, but they're not going to be doing it based on institutional objectives in order to preserve the prerogatives of Congress as opposed to the administration. In broad strokes, Congress has lost power with respect to the administrative state as a result of polarization. The president has conversely gained power. And there's been an increasing incentive for presidents to use unilateral action to exercise control over the administrative state in a situation where they can't get their policy objectives through the Congress. So something like immigration is a classic example. Barack Obama attempted to get immigration reform through the Congress. He probably should have done it in the first 2 years if he really wanted to get it done. But as his tenure in office continued, he made efforts to do it through the Congress. There was some sense that there might be a bipartisan coalition in Congress to pass immigration reform. But when it didn't emerge, then he said, I'm not going to wait for Congress to act. I've got a pen, I've got a phone, and with that pen, I'm going to exercise my power to issue executive orders and do other executive actions to move the ball forward, he said, right? And so he did that with respect to DACA and DAPA and other major policy changes that were done through unilateral executive action through the administrative state. The one thing about that, though, is that in a situation where there is shifting partisan control over the White House, the executive branch, the next administration can come in and undo what the prior administration did. And so that's exactly what we've seen. The centerpiece of the Trump administration has been using the president's power over the executive branch to try to undo what the Obama administration did. The last element of this is the courts. In a situation where Congress is not exercising effective control over the administrative state, the courts have stepped in a much bigger way to exercise a check on presidents and their unilateral use of executive power over the administrative state. And Mike talks about that in his chapter about how coalitions of state governments have used litigation to try to influence and block what presidents have tried to do through their unilateral power under the administrative state.
Okay, thanks. Michael?
Okay. Our federalism has become increasingly executive, it has become increasingly polarized, and it has become increasingly sectional, by which I mean it's been driven by contentions between blocks of states with very sharply divergent and irreconcilable interests. Those tendencies have now lasted for 4 decades under widely varying economic conditions, political constellations. They've reinforced each other. The little chapter I contributed to this volume explains why that has been so and why I think it will last. And for purposes at hand, I'll just mention 3 aspects of this. 1, the executive's dominance over federalism. 2, the sectional dynamics between state blocs. Ken just alluded to this. And 3rd, the lack of judicial doctrines that might reconstitutionalize federalism and the administrative state. So first point, executive dominance. Until the 1920s or so, federalism came from the Constitution and the courts. From the New Deal until roughly the 1980s, federalism came from Congress. That is where state lobbies and national politicians haggled out sort of cooperative federalism arrangements. Congress provided then funding and various other arrangements for intergovernmental programs, and it superintended all of that through periodic legislation, oversight committees, and so forth. All of that is history. Nowadays, federalism comes from the executive. That's how it hangs together with the administrative state, right? It comes from the EPA, from HHS, the Department of Education, all of them usually in close concert with the White House. And what these agencies do is they generate entire federalism programs from whole cloth, commandeer vast funding streams to state and local governments virtually at their discretion, and then they try to sort of cajole or entice ornery states into some form of cooperation. This push to executive federalism began under the Reagan administration, and later presidents of both parties then doubled and tripled and quadrupled down. Federalism in that way partakes of this sort of across-the-board drift towards executive government, but it also reinforces it. And the reason is that Congress has created a multitude of ambitious programs without paying any heed to the profound mismatch between the federal government's authority and its fiscal and administrative powers. The federal government can cut checks. It's very good at that. It has a comparative advantage. It has no administrative capacity to ensure that an endangered toad will actually live, or that student dating behavior on campuses is free from any kind of microaggression. If you want to do that, if the feds want to do that, they need armies of state and local officials. And so somewhat paradoxically, these greater assertions of federal power have meant a larger role for state and local officials and a smaller role for Congress, right? Congress cannot hope to sort of cajole or rein in states. Only the executive can do that. It has many more tools at its disposal. It's in business 24/7. It's relatively more nimble. It can act and bargain with individual states, and it can act strategically across program areas. Congress can't do that. It's only the executive. So the only question is, what does the executive do with all that power? Well, for one thing, and for starters, it improvises. So nominally, federal policies pursuing national objectives take on entirely different contours in individual states. Medicaid is the most cited example because it's 1/2 of all federal funding is Medicaid. So under the Obama administration, HHS tried to entice states into the Medicaid expansion, and it provided funding for systems ranging from Vermont's single-payer system to the sort of quasi-privatized system in Republican states. And the Trump administration has obviously sort of changed the policy orientation, but not the basic MO. Second, very often this improvisation becomes extra statutory. So states have been granted special treatment by executive edict, even where federal statutory law quite obviously forbids that. The implementation of the Affordable Care Act, immigration reform, global warming programs, other matters. All of that, as Ken mentioned, has proceeded through presidential initiative, often in defiance of the authority of Congress, frequently outside the law or without a legal basis, and this has been true of the Obama as well as the Trump administration. So statutory constraints that you can look up in the US Code matter only at the outer margins. The principal policy instrument is what has been called big waiver. In some areas of policy, you have sort of something approximating reverse preemption. So states that have legalized marijuana have been allowed to do so and have been granted exemptions from federal law, not, mind you, by Congress, but by DOJ memo. Some scholars have celebrated all of this as, hey, great, now we have transactional politics and we can get stuff done even in a polarized environment. I worry about that, and the reason why I worry about it is because at some point, sort of extra legal improvisation becomes what the founders called corruption. And I don't mean the sort of Paul Manafort chump change stuff. I mean the systematic executive mobilization of the entire machinery of government for partisan ends and oppression. We're not there yet, but I think the trends are troubling. I do not believe that there is a deep divide among the parties over the size of government. That would be news to me. I think the deconstruction burble was mostly nonsense. I think what the parties fight over is not the size of government. It's control over the government, and that means control by the executive. And the executive has become very, very partisan and resolute in strengthening the governing party state bloc. Take energy and environmental policy for reasons I'll mention in a moment. That's a key area, right? So the Obama administration had this fabulous clean power plan. It was obviously calculated to hammer red energy producing states, and the Trump administration has thrown all of that in reverse. It has rescinded the Clean Power Plan and other EPA rules. It has green-lighted the Keystone and Dakota pipelines, reduced monument areas. In Utah, for good measure, the 2018 tax reform contained provisions to permit oil exploration and drilling in Alaska. Same story with fiscal programs, much more intense partisan control and strategic use, especially under the Trump administration. Think of the SALT tax deduction reforms in the 2018 tax reform, which was obviously targeted at prosperous states and their taxpayers. Second point, sectional state divisions. So as everyone knows, there are red states and blue states, and under one party control. The ideological distance between the states has grown dramatically, and red and blue states now act as stable blocs on energy and environmental policy, immigration, labor law, the Affordable Care Act, the works. I just want to make it, that has lots of, there are lots of aspects, and I just want to emphasize one of them, which is the political economy that drives this. So the partisan divide, I think, between states at the state level maps a deep ideological divide between two very different business models, right? So blue states, New York and so forth, favor a quasi-European model, which reflects a very high demand for social services and environmental amenities, relatively high tolerance for accompanying tax payments. Red states are committed to a much more competitive and production-oriented agenda, and so long as labor and capital remain mobile in the United States, the blue state model is extremely hard to sustain, if you want to sustain it. Right? There's only so many times that New York can say no to Amazon while Virginia rolls out the red carpet. So if you want, and there's been lots of migration from high-tax blue states, out-migration, especially of productive citizens and firms. And so if blue states want to stem that, they need two things. One is a very, very high level of federal transfer payments, And the second is they have to figure out a way to impede red states' ability to attract mobile capital and labor. And they have to mobilize the federal government to create those impediments. This is what the economists call raising rivals costs. And lo and behold, blue states, New York, California, Connecticut, Illinois, consistent advocates, early adopters of federal spending programs, and their strategy to raise rivals costs is best illustrated by their demands on climate change and energy policy, right? So red states welcome oil, natural gas, other extractive industries, blue states not so much. And so the blue state bloc has tried to reduce red states' competitive and comparative advantages, both unilaterally through state regulations that raise the cost of energy production elsewhere, and much more often through aggressive federal regulation. That takes you back to the executive and the courts, right? These interstate sectional state conflicts are much too severe to be resolved through compromise in Congress. And so the state blocs turn to the executive to advance their interests, and when that doesn't work, they turn to the courts. Partisan state litigation, that is to say, litigation where cohesive, stable blocks of states litigate against each other and the federal government. That was unknown until the 1990s, and then showed up in a few cases, mostly involving gay rights. And starting in 2009, it took off. It's accompanied the Affordable Care Act, immigration policy, environmental regulation, lots of things on an ongoing basis. And again, the energy and environmental litigation over the Clean Power Plan illustrates the pattern. I want to end a few remarks on what this portends for the courts and the Supreme Court. The most immediate answer is increased pressure and partisanship. Right? So you look at the case law. There used to be an ideological divide about abortion and gay rights. Meanwhile, the same ideological divide has shown up in cases over the ACA, over energy cases, and even in cases involving far more legalistic questions. You look at the voting patterns in cases over or arising under the Federal Arbitration Act, which I won't bore you with, but the voting pattern, it might as well be about abortion. And preemption cases look the same way. It's really astounding. I think the deeper and more consequential problem there is that the court has no broadly accepted constitutionally based doctrines that would provide judicial legitimacy and credibility, right? So with respect to separation of powers and federalism, the court sort of has inherited doctrines and modes of thinking that are totally out of sync with the government that we now have. So you look at separation of powers doctrine, there's this picture of rival empire-building institutions, Congress versus the executive, and that Madisonian apparatus is completely mismatched to what is going on. So, for example, George Thomas mentioned the legislative veto case, right? The governing doctrine that lies behind that case and a lot of other jurisprudence treats Congress as a self-aggrandizing actor, as if that's the problem. Abdication is the problem, and the court has just no answer to that at all. You see the same lack of realism in administrative law, so the dogmatic premise of administrative law is legislative supremacy, the will of the Congress must prevail, right? But then it turns out Congress doesn't have to express that will with any clarity or confidence or precision, right? The executive gets discretion to exercise its expertise so long as Congress has stated an intelligible principle, and everything else is judicial deference. The idea there ostensibly is to give Congress an incentive to legislate more precisely if it doesn't like the agency's policies. I think that has become downright absurd. Congress doesn't rewrite statutes. The executive rewrites statutes all day long on a wholesale basis. right? You look at other areas, spending, agency spending decisions, almost wholly beyond judicial control. The question of executive government by waiver, that is to say, wholesale dispensation or suspension of the law, much discussed in the law reviews, no answer for the court, no viable doctrine at all. I cannot think of any separation of powers doctrine that is both constitutionally grounded and calculated to contain executive power these days. And federalism jurisprudence presents the same doctrinal mismatch, right? So the court intones that federalism is a question of balance between the federal government and the states collectively. And so long as you think about federalism in that sort of New Dealish, made-up, extra-constitutional fashion, you're bound to get the doctrines wrong and to miss what's actually going on. Right? So you're going to miss federalism's executive nature. When Congress goes AWOL, all the federalism cases become administrative law cases, but in those kinds of cases, the federalism canons come and go with no explanation, right? And most faithfully to my mind, this balance perspective misses the sectional features of federalism. The court speaks confidently of the authentic position of the states, even when the states oppose one another in that very case. It has no idea that states demand federal intervention as often as they resist it. The expanse, so just two more examples. The expansive standing doctrine, Massachusetts versus EPA standing, that kind of standing, state standing, has now migrated into other policy areas. That isn't a state protective doctrine at all. It's a license for some states to trample on other states, and the court just doesn't seem to comprehend that. More broadly, I think there ought to be increased judicial attention to state-to-state conflicts, but the court is completely oblivious to that, so it has permitted California and other states to impose taxes on energy imports. It's permitted coastal states, Pacific coastal states, to embargo Wyoming's coal. It permits state and local jurisdictions to impose tax collection and audit obligations on anyone who sells anything across this wide country on the internet, and on and on. The Constitution teems with state protective or horizontal federalism rules. Not one of them is still enforceable. And I think this mismatch between doctrine and institutional reality raises doubts about the judiciary's capacity to develop constitutional grounds or constitutionally grounded doctrines at any time in the near future. I think that task mostly now belongs to the academics.
Thanks, Michael. Sally?
Well, thank you. Can you all hear me using this device? Because I can't use the other. All right. In preparation, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. And in preparation, I read Ken's chapter in Parchment Barriers, which I thought was really excellent. I mean, I could quibble about some of his characterizations, because that's what you do in the academy, is you go to these workshops and you quibble about different things. But I thought he generally had it right with the formation and the growth and the history of the administrative state. And I want to, at some point today, talk about the consequences of the increased polarization on the administrative state, how it's being manifest, and what it might do to this administrative state, which we all know and some of us love. Now, as someone who came to Washington in the mid-1960s, the world has changed dramatically. In the 1960s, some of my best friends were Republicans. I wear a D jersey. I even went out, dated Republicans.
Oh, newsflash.
At that time, it was a very different construct. And as Lee Rutman was saying, you had a substantial number of moderate Republicans who were more liberal than a large number of conservative Democrats, and a large number of vice versa, so that you had a middle. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned so far today is the consequence of the fact that with the increased polarization, we do not have a middle. The middle has totally dropped out, and the middle had served a very important function of providing answers, of a forum to discuss the issues, and then a place where ideas could germinate and come to reality. Instead, we not only now have two separate parties, but the chasm between them is growing, seemingly daily. It is a huge jump from one to the other. On top of this, as Francis Lee was talking about, we've got this norm of divided government, which further complicates. I mean, you can't just look at polarization. I think you have to look at some of the other aspects of what is happening. The combination of polarization and divided government is not good. Rather than trying to find areas of agreement, it seems to be that the primary motivation is to keep the other guys from achieving their objectives. And I must say that it was rather stark, but not really surprising, when Mitch McConnell, who became the majority leader in 2010, and he was asked what he wanted to accomplish in the next 2 years, and his answer was, quote, this is quote, "Make sure President Obama is a one-term president." There's something very wrong with that being said and that being accepted as the way we're going to do business in Washington. Personally, I find it appalling, and would find it appalling if it were a Democrat saying that about a president. Now, the question of the administrative state that Ken referred to and that Michael also referenced, let's be clear. Presidents need accomplishments. They have to establish their legacies, if not implement their policy preferences. So if partisanship coupled with divided government is going to preclude legislative accomplishments, which are the most long-lasting and most visible, then the presidents are naturally going to turn to what they can accomplish without the help of Congress, and that means they'll seek to advance their agendas through the administrative state, and this is true for both Democratic and Republican presidents. Regrettably, as Ken has so ably documented, that's not what the administrative state was created to do. The administrative state, coupled with the civil service reform, and I bring that up because I think that's a very important aspect that hasn't been discussed so far today. It was to create entities which were repositories of specialized expertise that were distant, if not independent, from politics, so that they in turn could provide apolitical, that is, nonpartisan, neutral, scientific, technical, or economic expertise to implement the general guidelines established by Congress. That is, to faithfully execute the law, which is the main charge of Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, people will disagree as to whether this vision was ever even possible or ever realized, and if it was realized, how long it lasted, and to continue to deliver on its promises. But however it performed during the mid and late 20th century, the pressures on the administrative state have undoubtedly been exacerbated by the increased polarization of the last several decades. Consider, if you will, the plight of efficient, effective, and experienced administrators in the face of increased polarization and the dedication or loyalty of politicians and their appointees to party rather than policy. Among other things, The dynamics I've been describing have raised the stakes for carrying out the party agenda with no holds barred. If I wanted to be provocative, I would refer to the nomination and confirmation of people in this administration who not only are not sympathetic, but are affirmatively hostile to the missions of the agencies they've been appointed to lead. But even without being my unusual snarky self, I can observe that beginning with the landing teams, and then the actual appointees, the political leadership of regulatory agencies have put incredible pressure on the people in the agencies to move quickly, to implement whatever goal is established to achieve a partisan advantage, regardless of the consistency with past agency practices or its legitimacy based on sound science, sound economics. You get it. Indeed, in some agencies, the new political leadership did not trust the career civil service. They did not consult with career civil servants. And often, they didn't even advise the career civil servants what they were doing. So much for the expertise and the experience and the accumulated wisdom, not highly valued, to say the least. Now, I saw some statistics recently that I found very interesting. There have been roughly 30 attempts by the Trump administration to defer effective dates, hold in abeyance, suspend enforcement, or reverse Obama-era regulations that were challenged in the courts. Approximately 90% of these were reversed and remanded by the courts, sometimes in a matter of days after oral argument. Now, conventional wisdom is that the administration usually prevails on judicial review. There are some setbacks, but usually their record is very good. This record of disapproval by the courts for the first 2 years of the Trump administration is a real anomaly. So what happened? I mean, in many cases, it was a rush to decision without dotting the I's and crossing the T's, or not assembling the facts or supporting the results, or not explaining the changes. Was it the result of the decision makers not tapping into this expertise? Whatever. What is clear is that with the headlong pursuit of partisan advantage, the integrity of the administrative process and the institutions of the administrative state are being undermined. Whatever confidence people have in the expertise of the agencies is being diminished. When you can decide to flip from yes to no, from on to off, or off to on, and there's no explanation other than you want to reverse what has been done before, there are real consequences. One of those is disruption and uncertainty, which is not good for business. It's not good for predictions of what you're going to be planning to do. But there's also a collateral loss in the suspicion is that the system itself is too easily manipulated for ulterior purposes. The system, in other words, is not solid, is not worthy of respect, is not what we should rely on. That necessarily places the administrative state in a highly tenuous position. And even I, who love the administrative state and defend the administrative state, are quite upset with what is happening with the assistance, or at least the acquiescence, of my former agency, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB, which is one of the gatekeepers for the administrative system of rulemaking. It is extraordinarily difficult for me to criticize OIRA, for I'm a firm believer in its mission, and I know that the people who work there, the civil servants who are there, are among the best analysts and the best public servants in government. But the process seems to have been compromised in the service of furthering political, indeed partisan views. How else to explain that for 30 years, OIRA stood for solid, straight-up analysis? It consistently pushed back when agencies tried to regulate when benefits did not justify or outweigh costs. But now it's not pushing back when those same agencies are rescinding regulations where the benefits of doing so are greatly outweighed by the costs. When they advocate, and they allow agencies to advocate, for counting indirect costs, but accept the decision of the same agency not to count, under any circumstances, indirect benefits. I'm referring to co-benefits for those of you in the know. When they accept arguments that 20 or 30-year-old studies documenting benefits are too old, they're outdated, and they accept 20, 30, 40-year-old estimates of costs, perfectly sound basis for decision-making. That's the clean water rule. When they accept notices of proposed rulemaking without an accompanying cost-benefit analysis and say, we'll get that when we do the final rule. That's a little late for people to comment on it. Because the cost-benefit analysis that was done twice at the agency showed that the costs of the rule that was being proposed greatly exceeded the benefits. And they accept other proposals where the agency, in fact, explicitly concedes that the costs will be appreciably greater and more widespread than the benefits. This is the Clean Power Plan, which hasn't gone through yet, but it's being proposed. Now, these are not just minor flaws in the implementation of an academic concept of cost-benefit analysis. This speaks much more loudly to the very integrity of a process that has governed rulemaking for 35 years, and it does so without any explanation or excuses or even apologies. And that has serious consequences for our democracy, because we do not live with a cop on every block to make sure that regulated entities comply with regulations. We achieve a relatively high rate of compliance because regulated entities generally follow the rules. They want to do what they are told they are supposed to do, and they generally do that. They do it in part because they have been participants in the process that has produced the rules. That's what the notice and comment process is all about. They have their voices heard, and when their voices are rejected, it's explained in the reason and basis of the rulemaking record why their views did not held sway. Their participation leads to buy-in, and buy-in leads to compliance. So when the system itself is discredited and the end product seems to have occurred not on the merits, but for political or partisan gain, then the foundation of the process is at risk of collapse. When scientists, technicians, economists are ignored, the raison d'etre of the administrative state is in doubt, its product can be dismissed without much regret, and I greatly fear that we are approaching that point. There's already too much bureaucrat bashing in this country, too much insidious, undeserved criticism of competent people who are labeled disparagingly as bureaucrats for just doing their job. There's too much doubt about the value of government in advancing and protecting our values, our health, our safety, and even our lives. I apologize for the rant, but I believe that polarization has fueled the tendencies to trammel the administrative state, and that will be a loss for all of us.
Bill?
Yeah. Well, as you will hear from my voice, I'm at what I hope is the tail end of an illness that has produced a cough that is even more annoying for you than it is for me. And for this reason, among others, I'll be brief. Let me begin by saying that it is a real pleasure to attend a conference where the administrative state is a topic of inquiry, not a term of abuse, let alone a progressive plot against the Constitution. Every sermon needs a text. Here's mine. Federalist number 68. The true test of a good government is its aptitude and tendency to produce a good administration. Now, I think it's interesting to note that Alexander Hamilton said that within a discussion of the presidency. And he clearly thought that the president and the executive branch would turn out to be preeminent in delivering a good administration. I should also say that almost in the same breath, Hamilton said this: there will be a constant probability of seeing the presidency filled by characters preeminent for ability and virtue. Oh well. Let me proceed to my principal thesis. You heard a long, very rich panel on political polarization from some of the country's best political scientists. It's all true. It's not an exaggeration. We are living at a polarization spike in our nation's history. And this has had a variety of institutional consequences. Let me begin with the one that I think matters most, and that is the impact on Congress. Congress is no longer a functional branch of the government of the United States. And let me explain why very briefly. Imagine a 2x2 table. Along one dimension, you have small and not significant ideological and policy differences between the parties. At the other end, very substantial differences between the parties. That's the qualitative dimension. On the quantitative dimension, you have situations where one party is overwhelmingly dominant, and at the other end, a narrow balance between the two political parties. A large ideological gap between the political parties does not lead to dysfunction in circumstances where one party is clearly dominant. The very worst place to be within the Madisonian Constitution is in the box where political parties are both deeply divided qualitatively and narrowly divided quantitatively. And that is where we are. And that is where, as Fran Lee pointed out, we have been for quite some time. This has led, as many political scientists have pointed out, to a collapse of what Madison assumed would be institutional loyalty, loyal to the institution in favor of loyalty to the party. One of the consequences of that has been the evisceration of the system of impartial oversight, which is one of the principal ways in which the Congress of the United States is supposed to exercise control, not only over the executive branch, but also that particular entity known as the administrative state. Now, it is not very original to say that politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. If you have a Congress that, for the most part, cannot legislate, cannot do oversight, well then, what do you expect? Right? It was the very same Alexander Hamilton who talked about energy in the executive Sally quite properly pointed out that people don't get to be president by accident. They get to be president because they want to do something. Now, if the normal route to doing things, at least in domestic policy, is blocked by the incapacity of Congress to legislate, then presidents will be sorely tempted to legislate by other means. And presidents of both parties have succumbed to that temptation. But it's important to understand the dynamic here. If we had a functioning Congress, we'd be having a different conversation. Now, what is to be done? Congressional reform is a vast topic. I can't possibly address it here, and I won't. There are a lot of people around town who are working 24/7 on the problem. There's even a select committee on the modernization and reform of Congress. And like many others, I am working to make that project a success. But let us assume, contrary to fact, that we had a Congress that had the will to do something to fulfill its appropriate role vis-a-vis the administrative state. Does it have the capacity to do so? The answer is no. The situation is very similar to the situation that existed in the 1960s, where the executive branch enjoyed preeminence over the budget process. The executive branch had the Office of Management Budget. What did Congress have? Nothing. One of the most important institutional reforms in Congress in the past half century was the development of the Congressional Budget Office, which greatly enhanced congressional capacity to do independent reviews of the budgetary and economic consequences of particular proposals. I am a huge fan of a proposal I think first surfaced by Phil Wallach and Kevin Kosar of R Street to create a congressional regulation office, parallel to CBO, that would give Congress its in-house capacity to do serious regulatory analysis. While they're about it, I would hope that they would restore the Office of Technology Assessment, because the lack of technological knowledge in Congress is a global embarrassment at this point, but that's another topic and another rant. Okay, more broadly, and here I quote from a very interesting draft article by Michael Livermore and Daniel Richardson that was circulated in advance of the conference. And here is the most important sentence from that article. The current party system and its interaction with administrative law poses serious threats to many values that are central to effective administration. Among them, regulatory certainty, institutional legitimacy, and fact-based decision making. Now, the central point of this article is that administrative law, administrative institutions are not free to be politically naive. They're not free to pretend that the political context of the administrative state has not been changed by political polarization. So what are some practical consequences that you can draw from that? And here I am venturing into deep waters about which I know little, but I do want to put these ideas on the table because I think they're worthy of debate. Number one, we now have what amounts to asymmetry between adopting a rule or regulation on the one hand and reversing or replacing it on the other. There is nothing equivalent to the idea of stare decisis in the operation of the regulatory system, which means, according to Livermore and Richardson, that there is no way of taking reliance interests and the costs of regulatory instability into account in the way that the process now operates. If that is true, that is a bad thing. We ought to think about changes in laws and procedures that will build in the costs of instability into the burden of proof that a reversal of a regulation needs to discharge. That's point number one. Point number two, and this is an idea that I introduce with great trepidation at a conference co-sponsored by the Antonin Scalia Law School. Pause for a deep breath. Is it time to reconsider Chevron deference? Is it time, given this broader environment, to give or to create doctrines, in Michael Grieva's sense, that will enhance the regulatory review authority of the courts? I can see many arguments against this, but I can see a good argument for it. And that is, it is one mechanism whereby the idea of reliance interests and the costs of instability could be built into the regulatory process. Third and finally, in circumstances of intense political polarization, I think there is a strong argument for a deliberate policy of increased insulation from politics for agency leaders and boards against swings in political fortune. I do not think that the Federal Reserve Board is such a bad model of insulation. I'll go even farther and outrage everybody and say that I'm not even convinced that the CFPB is such a bad model. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks. Bill, let's pick up actually where you just left off, not on the CFPB, but on Chevron. Because as it happens, there's now been, for a decade now, a thriving debate over reconsideration of judicial deference doctrines, especially on the right. By many accounts, Justice Scalia himself was reconsidering Chevron or being open to recalibrating Chevron near the end of his life. And 2 days ago, the Supreme Court heard a case, Kaiser versus Wilkie. It wasn't about Chevron, but it was about the related doctrine of our deference, Seminole Rock deference. Strikes me as interesting in all of this is the fact that you see defense of deference on the left primarily stated in terms of deference to technical expertise. You see attacks on deference from the right primarily in terms of rule of law. And in all of this debate, we see a clearing out of the point that animated Justice Scalia and others in calling for deference in the first place, which was democratic accountability. Right? An idea that agencies are not just in the business of interpreting laws and in making expert judgments, but they're also in the business of making value judgments, which ultimately have to be routed up through the president, who's elected by the people. And so my question for everybody is, in these debates about the political polarization and its effect on the administrative state, I'm wondering, what role should democratic accountability and value judgments play in the work of these agencies? Or is it time to think of these agencies not necessarily exclusively, but overwhelmingly in terms of just expertise in the rule of law? Throw that to anybody. Sally?
I'll start so you can all attack what I say. First of all, the Chevron doctrine has 2 steps. Deference comes in step 2. Step 1 is, did Congress address the issue, or was it silent? Was it ambiguous, or was it silent? If it was not, if it was clear, or at least indicative, and you get there, footnote 9, by using all the tools of statutory construction, if you can discern Congress's intent, you go with Congress's intent. It is only if Congress has not spoken to the issue, that you ever even get to the issue of deference. So the courts have the first bite, and they have used it aggressively, including Justice Scalia and others, to resolve issues on the ground that Congress had actually decided this question. There's a difference in FDA versus Williamson off-track, off-ramp that is available, which is if this is an issue, and this is what he was used in King versus Burwell, and was used in FDA versus Williamson, the last one, the regulation by the FDA of tobacco. King versus Burwell is the Obamacare and what deference should be given to the IRS, not to the HHS. And in those two cases, and there are others now at the courts of appeals level that say that if it's a very significant issue on which you cannot assume that Congress would have delegated the decision-making to the agency, the courts then should make that decision. So Chevron is not all deference all the time for all works of art. No, it's not. It's really quite cabined to start with. And finally, if I may, if you don't have deference to the agencies, then you're going to have decisions not by Congress, not by those who are democratically elected, but by my very good friends and relatives in the judiciary. Are the courts more democratically accountable than the administration? I think not. To say nothing of continuity and consistency, because you've got all these district courts, all these courts of appeals around the country. If they're making decisions, you do not have uniform administration of law, and that can be very complicated because the Supreme Court doesn't hear that many cases. So I'm going to come out for defense of Chevron, mostly.
Can I?
Yeah, please, Michael.
This will be somewhat indirect, but I want to take up a point that both Sally and Bill mentioned, which I think is hugely important, and to announce this in advance, I don't even know whose side I'm on in this particular fight, okay? Sally, you mentioned the sort of OIRA piece and the disregard for fact and expertise and so forth. I'm with you, and I'm with Bill for sort of, let's insulate agencies somewhat from the political hubbub up to a point, because there are some things where you actually want independent experts to have a voice and an important role and to be listened to. My fear is that that ship has sailed. Nobody believes that technocratic agenda anymore. I mean, you know, in the dark ages when I was young, there was an AEI Brookings Joint Center on Regulation. All of these people committed to a basically technocratic agenda. You could try to recreate that now, but nobody would listen. Nobody's interested in that. And I worry about that on the one hand because I sort of resist the sort of populist rabble with the experts. On the other hand, there has also been, it's the concern about the experts is legitimate to my mind, to the extent that people think, well, the experts, they're the ones with the PowerPoint slides, and they are the ones who have made a mess of things, of our lives, and up to a point, they have a point, right? And the experts have had a fateful tendency of overclaiming, of disguising value judgments. Let's hear it for yet another federal program under the guise of expertise. The CFPB has been an absolute, under the Obama administration, was an absolute master at phony data and saying, trust us, it's all expertise, whereas it was a complete power grab, right? And so there is too much distrust in the system now on both sides to sort of regenerate something like the OIRA agenda of the 1980s and early 1990s. That ship has basically sailed. I don't know what to do about it. What I'm quite confident of is that if you try to recreate administrative law doctrines or regenerate administrative law doctrines by finding sort of some compromise on a basis of deference to Congress and agency expertise, you are going to fail. You have to, it seems to me, go back to sort of basic, fundamental, non-functionalist constitutional intuitions and try to think your way through this. I'm not saying I know how to do that and what it would look like, but I'm pretty sure that has to be the agenda, because sort of a neo-New Deal version of this whole edifice is just not going to stick and not going to calm anybody down.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll just
Go ahead, Ken.
jump in briefly. It seems to me that there already is a scaling back of Chevron deference, that the court has said on these issues of very significant policies that it's willing to forego deference because it doesn't want these agencies to be able to make major policy decisions without substantial judicial review, right? But on the other hand, I can't imagine the courts wanting to do, extensive oversight of the agencies on matters of technical, where there's the loser in a regulatory fight goes to court and tries to get the court to overturn it. I just can't imagine the courts are going to want to get in that business. So there's a potential for a two-tier system. I'm not actually sure how you would meaningfully draw the line between those two, but it seems to have a little bit of rationale to it, to have the courts giving significant review to major policy issues, but not on more technical issues.
Let me ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. A few times throughout this panel, we've heard reference to the basic point that Congress is gridlocked, and president after president says, if Congress won't act, then I will. I want to push back against that, or at least suggest that maybe that view of things is incomplete. It seems to me that there's another problem. It's that members of Congress think to themselves, because presidents will act, we don't need to, right? That after almost a century of accumulation of broad delegations of power, presidents have it within their discretion, their agencies, to do almost anything in any major policy of the day. And I wonder what sort of effect that has on legislation itself, and if maybe that is itself a cause of gridlock. Why would a member of Congress in the president's party negotiate with the other side if their president can act? And by the same token, why would people in the other party negotiate when they know the president can act? I think we just saw this in the debate over funding the border wall, where from the very beginning of at least the Senate's debate, everybody understood the president might just go off and do his own thing. I think we saw it similarly in 2009 in the debates over climate change, when President Obama announced from the outset, in the very beginning of a moment where he had both houses of Congress, that if Congress didn't legislate on this, the EPA would simply move forward. And the reason why I bring it up in this context is because I think polarization exacerbates this, because the same polarization that brings Congress, that deters Congress from acting for all the reasons that Professor Lee said this morning, in the first panel, it has the opposite effect in administration. It further energizes the president. A polarized politics gives the president more energy because there's less disagreement within his administration and his party. And so I wonder if maybe we need to take this from the other side, that we'll only get Congress unlocked if the courts or some other political force prevents the administration from having so much discretion. I'll just throw that out there. Does anybody have any thoughts?
Well, very quickly. There has been, regrettably, an extended process of congressional abdication, right? This hasn't simply been an executive power grab.
Right.
If you look at the astonishing proliferation of emergency powers awarded to the president over the past 50 years, plus the substantial evisceration of the mechanism that was designed to give Congress some say in the employment of those emergency powers, nobody forced the Congress of the United States to give that away. They did it. And I think that was not a consequence of polarization. It's a much more complicated phenomenon. In the case of foreign policy, it is perfectly obvious that many members of Congress do not want to take responsibility for fundamental foreign policy decisions, decisions about war and peace. And every once in a while there's an uprising, but these are little like volcanic eruptions after an extended period of tranquility during which the president is doing exactly what he wants. Having said that, I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. These people are not stupid. They understand the distinction between an executive order and legislation. They understand that what one president does, sua sponte, can be wiped away by the next president if it happens to be of a different persuasion or party. They understand that anything other than a legislative process is likely to be the equivalent of building sandcastles at the edge of the beach. So the idea that they're satisfied with this situation, satisfied to give this kind of power to the president, it's not what they came to Washington to do. And you just need to talk with them to see that.
Well, let's open the floor to questions. We have one microphone, so raise your hand and please be patient while the microphone comes to you. We'll start with you, sir, and then Andrew, our Deputy Director, next.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanusi with United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. I listened to the first panel, and I was trying to make this comment because one of the panelists mentioned the word political culture twice.
The word what, sir?
Political culture twice. I came to this country 50 years ago. The political culture of America has changed. So, and Professor Carlson was going in that direction in the interpersonal relationship. So most of the problem you're facing is because of that political culture has changed and the administrative state and the other doctrines that comes with them that have not adjusted to become, how you call it, more functional and effective in this new environment that you're facing. If I was in court, I would be considered an expert witness in the area. You guys are all in law. I'm in PhD in political science, public management, etc.
Anybody have any reactions to that?
Very briefly. In my lifetime, I've lived through two very different periods of American politics. One period in which the two political parties more or less agreed on fundamentals and argued about the details. In my view, one of the single most important political episodes of the 20th century in American politics was Dwight Eisenhower's defeat of Robert Taft at the 1952 Republican Convention. Because Eisenhower ran for the nomination on the basis of what he called modern republicanism. Modern republicanism meant that conservatives would make their peace with the New Deal, but would be able to administer it more effectively, efficiently, and with less corruption. That was the argument. The administrative state was, in my view, never a sort of a technical exercise, neutral expertise. It functioned within a background consensus about what its purposes were, what its legitimacy was, etc. And at a particular point in time, that consensus collapsed. And the idea of neutral expertise gets caught in a crossfire of political polarization. And that crossfire makes it very difficult to preserve, and here I think Michael is on to something, what I will call the old order.
Right.
If it's politics all the way down, then where is expertise? And there's a problem here, and that is that in order to do technical analyses, you have to make substantive assumptions about certain kinds of values, right? What is the social cost of carbon? Okay? Well, I mean, I know what it is conceptually, but we can have a big argument about the social costs of carbon. And, you know, in the public policy school, where I was once dean, we taught cost-benefit analysis. But one of the first things our students saw was that how you define costs and benefits is not itself a neutral enterprise. And so that whole system will function when there is a political culture of consensus that sustains it. When that political culture dissolves, as it has in my lifetime, we find ourselves in today's situation.
So, Bill, are you saying that the problem is politics or political disagreement? Right? Is the problem that we just don't agree on the political values? Like the problem is the lack of agreement, or the problem is that at its core there are those political values embedded in these techniques?
What I'm saying is that there's a world of difference between a political system where the leading parties agree on fundamentals and a system in which they don't. And my lifetime has been evenly divided between the one and the other, and the difference is enormous.
Can I just say
Sure,
two
Mike.
things? I mean, emerging agreement. One of the, maybe what you want to do in this environment is to reparochialize our politics at all levels. And what I mean by that is pay more attention to sort of idiosyncratic, localized concerns, right? And that is what congressional committees paid attention to. That is what made their cooperation across partisan lines possible. That is how they were constituted in the first place. That's very hard to replicate, it seems to me, in an administrative process. I mean, take cost-benefit analysis. It's all Calorie-Hicks, right? From here to eternity, there are greater benefits than costs. Let's go, because we can always compensate the losers. It then turns,
But we never do.
And we never do. And so obviously then the losers start sort of getting nervous about the entire exercise of technocracy on their backs. So maybe that's an answer. Have a little less faith in abstract and neutral expertise. I totally agree with Bill. That idea has become increasingly contested in a way in which it was not in the old order. I think that's actually a fairly good term. I'll say one last thing. I'm getting a little nervous about celebrating moderate American parties of the 1950s and how great all of that was, because what made that overlap and consensus and all that harmony possible is that Southern whites had ended up in the wrong party. And as soon as that sort of broke, which was in the 1960s, and Lyndon Johnson's famous remark, it was all systems go. You had to have this. I mean, that is what eventually produced the partisan ideological polarization that we have now. I trust nobody wants to go back to the days of Jim Crow and that bizarre, sort of odd constellation of parties. So there was agreement on the old order. There was a lot of disagreement and really fundamental disagreements in American politics. It just didn't run along party lines because of this odd legacy.
I just want to add, by the way.
May I just
sure, go ahead, Sally.
I don't want to go back to the 50s and Jim Crow, but I want to go back to something that George Thomas talked about in the first panel.
You want to be able to date Republicans again.
Not now. I'm married. I mean, I can't date.
Believe me, I know your
I didn't want
husband.
that to come out. I
was a joke.
still have Republican friends. I really do have Republican friends. I want to get back to what George Thomas said, because this discussion has evolved into sort of like what's wrong in Washington and what presidents are doing and what members of Congress are doing. And you're absolutely right. The members of Congress didn't come here to do what they're doing now, and they're very frustrated. And they are afraid of taking on certain, lifting certain issues and getting involved in them. But what George said in the first panel was that one of his proposed solutions was education. I think what we're seeing in this polarized world, and I really want to bring us back to it, is the product of a failure of education in our country about what government does, about what a phenomenal experiment was launched over 200 years ago in creating the first democratic representative government. We all love STEM, and we want our schools to teach science and technology and engineering and math. And you know what we've lost, aside from chorus and cooking and metal shop and band and some of the other things? We've lost civics. I teach at a law school. Some of my kids did not have a good grounding in American government. That's not where we should be. We need to correct that. And I think that some of the issues that we're talking about can be top-down corrected. But I think we have not to lose sight of the imperative of bottom-up. And that's where George was with education. And I just want to say that that's where I am as well.
I should drop a footnote to this entire conversation and say that if my colleague from the Hoover Institution, Morris Fiorina, would here, he would reject the premise of a lot of the discussion, right? He'd say, yes, the parties have sorted, but the people haven't sorted.
Yeah, and he'd be wrong.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Bill.
And he said that, he wrote that a while ago.
No, he's still writing it.
He's still writing it.
He's
He's
still
still
writing it.
wrong.
So, well, we've exhausted
Now more than ever.
we have exhausted our time, and I see the bottles of wine out there. I'll give, because
We all need a drink.
well, I'll give Ken a final word, and then I'll just say a word in closing.
Yeah, I just want to again thank Adam and the Gray Center for hosting this event. It's been a fantastic opportunity for me and the other authors of this book to have a really terrific discussion, and appreciate all of you for coming out this afternoon as well. So thank you very much.
And just one last word, or two last words of my own. First of all, for all the discussion of Congress, I want to point out the Gray Center's next big public conference is May 2nd. It's actually on Capitol Hill at the Hart Senate Office Building, where we have a discussion of what we call the Constitution's first branch, rediscovering legislative power. So please keep an eye on your email inbox for that. I also should say, since we've had so many authors come across today's panels, for those in the audience, especially students who want to read more about these issues, I'd recommend, first of all, of course, Yuval Levin's journal, National Affairs, and as well, Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, where you can often read Bill Galston. And then, of course, being the Claremont McKenna College and its proximity to the Claremont Institute, I should add, please keep an eye out for the Claremont Review of Books. And with that, thank you all for joining us. Please join me in thanking our speakers today.